a single point of success? Is it just about like heroic founders who try to take everything on their shoulders, or there is a deeper insight that we should get from the article?
I think there's a big insight, which is that typically we all start out as individual contributors, right? IC roles. And then over time, what tends to happen is that companies promote the best doers to being responsible for others. And it's a totally different skill set to lead others versus to lead yourself. And we don't typically train people on how to make that transition. So it becomes something that you just have to figure out. And the challenge that you have is that if you're a really good doer, your achievement drive is driven by how hard you work and how smart you are. But all of a sudden, when you now have other people you're responsible for, it's less about your achievement drive, more about your relationship drive. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of framing this through an assessment that we use called REACH. Mm-hmm. Right? And the REACH assessment on the x-axis has your achievement drive, and on the y-axis has your relationship drive. And so if you are a driver, it's somebody that is high on achievement but low on relationship. And that's okay as an IC, but when you then become a people leader, you need to move more into this coaching quadrant where you still have high achievement needs, but you as much rely on the relationship. And the relationship is about getting things done through others rather than getting things done yourself. And I think this is the heroics don't scale kind of quote is the challenge that leaders have, which is I can do it all myself, works in a small context, but at scale it doesn't work. And so the single point of failure or of success, the reason I called it a single point of success is that if somebody is highly successful and has an ego to them, they are used to having success. And so to actually call them a single point of success, they can't deny that that's true. But if you call them a single point of failure,
they will be
defensive. And so it's a kind of reframing of of a statement that you hear all the time, but turning it into a positive, which has a negative connotation. And so that was my methodology in doing this. Was I was working with a specific leader who had a hero mindset, and I kept saying to him, "You got to get off the field." And that's the sports analogy of you go from being a player on the field to a coach on the sideline to the general manager who sits up in a box calling the plays down to the field and can't actually touch the ball anymore.
So how did you help that leader make this transition?
I think it's an awareness thing first and foremost. And it's an awareness that if your desire is to have success beyond you, then you actually have to make yourself redundant or unnecessary. And that's a hard thing, for somebody with a hero mindset to do, because they want, the credit. And so what you need to get them to do is to be able to shift from saying I to saying we, and even getting from we to they. So you take yourself out of it, and the success of others then becomes a reflection on your leadership rather than a reflection on what you did.
That makes sense. I remember we did a video on micro leadership.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this term doesn't exist, but I did come across the term macro leadership.
Macro
leadership,
okay.
Which the author, Henry, I'm blanking on the name, Mitzberg, okay. I think.
Yeah.
He said that this is a popular thing where the leader is told to over-delegate, like delegate without creating context or setting the team up for success or communicating a lot of essentially informal oral information that the leader has access to, but the person executing the task does not. So that has been my challenge, over-delegating sometimes, as we're working through this transition from being in the weeds, having all the knowledge, being the best informed, having all those information points, connections, relationships to do things perfectly. And now we need to rely on the team. How do we make that transition without
Yeah.
losing productivity,
Yeah.
efficiency.
Yeah. So, Blanchard and Hershey have this situational leadership model. And I think that it makes a lot of sense because what it does is it maps the level of autonomy to the level of competency, right? So the more competent somebody is, the more autonomy you give them, both in tasks and in overall ownership. And so you go from being kind of command and control to a supportive role based on that. But you put somebody in a role and you just delegate to them, you don't know what you're going to get. And so the approach would be to start off by delegating tasks, finite tasks that can then be measured. Did they or didn't they accomplish what they were asked to do? And then if they check the box and they do that, then they start to build trust, right? Your trust in their ability to execute what they've been asked to do or told to do. Over time, you get to the point where instead of delegating tasks, you delegate ownership to them. And the difference is telling them what needs to be done versus telling them what to do. I think that's a big differentiator. And I think in that micro leadership article, I asked, or said the quote, which is that people would rather be told what needs to be done than what to do. But as a leader, if you tell somebody what needs to be done and then it doesn't get done, all of a sudden that trust in their competence goes away and you go back to micromanaging them and leaning in. And instead of delegating ownership, you delegate tasks to them once again. And that's not a scalable model because when you delegate tasks, the person completes the task. What do they do at the end of the task? They come back to you and say, hey, boss, finish that. What's next? And if everybody that works for you has to keep coming back to you to find out what's next, that model is never going to get you to give people the autonomy to learn, grow, and scale.
So again, with the mental model, what you're sharing seems very intuitive.
Yeah.
And even situational leadership example is super easy. So why is it so hard?
Because we as people have in our mind that if we did a job or did it, that we can do it better than others. And so we have to learn that just because somebody takes a different approach doesn't mean that it's better or worse than the way that we would do it. And so you have to be willing to get out of the way and allow that opportunity for a different outcome than the one that we had predicted or asked for. And sometimes that outcome or solution that others come up with is even better. I think that's it's a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around. I think parenting is a good example of this. When you try to convince your children to do something because it's something that you like to do or the way you want them to do something, they'll resist and push back. But when you give them the freedom to choose or decide on their own, they draw their own conclusions and it makes them, more contented.
So is the shortcut taking this more strategic view, anticipating that by stepping back, you create more space?
Yeah, I think by giving people more degrees of freedom, and I go back to it's not the yellow, and white lines on the road that you have to stay between in their very narrow parameters. It's the boat channel that's the red marker and the green marker that you can go anywhere within the channel and be safe. And so you have more degrees of freedom. So the more degrees of freedom you can give somebody, the more opportunity they have to put their mark on the way that they do things.
And in terms of coaching, is there a signs in terms of helping like a new leader or an experienced leader to overcome this single point of success mentality?
I think it goes back to this idea of, even in the Lencioni 5 dysfunctions model, that trust is at the foundation. I think people use the term trust too broadly. And I'll say there's two types of trust. There's the trust in the integrity and honesty of somebody, which is table stakes. I'm assuming that people think that you can trust your employees. They're going to, ethically do the right things. But the other type of trust is the other more difficult one, which is the trust in their abilities. And that is one that takes time, and it really boils down to giving them activities or actions to achieve. And the more they do achieve them with speed and quality, the more you then could let go. And if you continue to find yourself going to the meetings, doing the work yourself, you'll realize that you're a single point of success. I had this conversation yesterday with a coaching client who said that in order to get a promotion, he needs to become a more known quantity to the people several levels above him. And he said for his team, one of the things that he does is if someone above him asks for information, he goes to the person on his team that would have the information, asks them to pull the information together, and then asks them to be in touch with the more senior person to give it to them, rather than his boss asks him to give the information to them and then they relay it back up. And so by giving your people below you exposure to the skip level versus everything having to flow through you as a conduit, that makes you not a single point of success.
And it looks like through this behavior, there is also a culture shift.
Mm-hmm.
So from an organization that is like the strong leader focused and an organization where the team is affected.
It's a more team focused. Yeah.
Are there any challenges in terms of like team dynamics or culture dynamics? Like, yes, individual can make the decision. Does the team jump on board easily, or do you sometimes see challenges that people are not ready for that?
You definitely see challenges, because one of the issues that you see in teams, especially teams of all peers in an organization that has a pyramid, there are fewer seats at the top. And I see this often in 360 feedback, is that people do a good job managing up to their boss and a good job managing down to their team members or the direct reports, but they struggle with managing across with their peers because they compete with their peers. Unless they are at the executive team level where there's no seat above, if they want to get to that next level, the peers are the ones that they're competing with. And so collaborating and being a good team player with your peers sometimes is pushed aside by the competitive nature.
So how does this mind shift from stopping being a single point of success align with this competitive culture?
Yeah, it's even trickier. We talk specifically about at the top, but it happens at lower levels as well. And those that are seen as out for themselves in organizations, often get punished for that behavior. And those that are seen as more collaborative get rewarded for that behavior.
So essentially, organization is looking to promote those folks who are seen as single point of success.
At times that may be true. And I think the bigger the organization, the more that there's a challenge between letting the work speak for itself and speaking for the work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this fine line between confidence and arrogance, where people have to make enough noise and take enough credit that they are seen for what their team was able to accomplish. But the we did it together, I think, will always get you further than I did it alone.
So what do you think is the biggest, like Groove Management works with a number of organizations of different cultures. What have you seen the biggest kind of impact of collaboration with Groove Management on this aspect of company culture and cross-team?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the companies that tend to perform the best, view this as a team sport rather than an individual sport. And I love that quote that it's not the name on the back of the jersey, it's the name on the front of the jersey, which is the team or company name, not your own name. I grew up a Yankees fan, and the Yankees tend not to put their names on the back of their jerseys, which is kind of an interesting thing versus a lot of other sports teams all have the individual names. They just have the number. And maybe, they did make it to the World Series this year. They didn't win, but maybe there is something to be said about, the ways that you instill a team mindset.
That makes a lot of sense. For you personally, as you were working on this article and given your experience, was there anything, like any insights that you gleaned from like rethinking your experience and writing this out?
just to be more self-aware, even personally, of when I'm being kind of the single point of success, right? And recognizing that, for instance, I didn't name Groove Management Ryan Formato, Consulting. I did it intentionally with a different name, with the hope that the company could scale beyond me. And we've had many of these conversations, and you've been a good challenge point on, well, there's other alternative ways of doing things, or, you need to allow other things to unfold. So yeah, I think that I wasn't thinking about a specific person when I wrote this piece, but there were several people that resembled that single point of success.
So what should we do if we see ourselves as this? Is there like a specific thing, habit, or action we can take to change the trajectory a little bit?
First is to recognize and acknowledge that too much is on you. I had written a piece several years ago about, hey, CEO, what keeps you up at night? And does what keeps you up at night keep your direct reports up at night?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that thing around sharing not only in the success, but also sharing in the misery and the pain. And maybe that's the first place that's easier for somebody to go, which is like, delegate your problems and collectively solve them. And then that becomes a model for delegate your successes and share them too.
That actually resonates with me because it addresses the concern I mentioned earlier about, like, a lot of information in companies is privileged and it's oral, and only managers know that. And usually it's around like challenges and problems. So if you start sharing those problems, people are more informed when tasks are being delegated to them.
Yeah. Well, the other piece of this though is, we talked about dissecting successes. And this idea that people tend to dissect and do postmortems on their failures, but not on the successes. And if you dissect a success, there's a high likelihood that there were more inputs to the success than the single point. And it then becomes an opportunity to see that, okay, well, you're taking credit for it or thinking that you're a single point of success. The truth is that it goes beyond you, and it wouldn't have happened without other people's involvement.
100%. Thank you, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Igor.
Yeah. So with that too.